You know those people who seem to stop wanting the things everyone else keeps chasing? Not in some dramatic "I sold everything and moved to a cabin in the woods" kind of way. But quietly, one day they're upgrading their phone every year, shopping whenever they're stressed, talking about dream cars, planning the next luxury vacation. Then something changes. They keep the same phone for 5 years. They stop buying things they don't need. They start enjoying simple weekends at home. They spend less. They own less. They need less. And somehow, they seem genuinely happier because of it. While most people are chasing bigger paychecks, bigger houses, and bigger lifestyles, there's an entire group of people quietly discovering that happiness seems to grow in the opposite direction. According to research in positive psychology, their brains may actually process reward differently from people who constantly feel the need for more. What you're about to hear may completely change the way you think about happiness, success, and why some people genuinely need so little to feel fulfilled. Let's begin with why most people always want more. Here's the thing. The endless pursuit of more isn't a character flaw. It isn't greed. And it isn't materialism. In many ways, it's exactly how the human brain was designed to work. Deep inside your brain is an ancient reward system. Every time you buy something new, receive praise, earn more money, or improve your social status, your brain releases dopamine. That feeling of excitement isn't accidental. It's biology. Studies in neuroscience have shown that anticipated rewards activate many of the same neural circuits involved in motivation, survival, and learning. Your brain doesn't simply enjoy getting more. It learns to expect it. But it goes even deeper than that. For hundreds of thousands of years, having more resources meant surviving longer. More food meant a better chance of living. More shelter meant greater protection. More allies meant greater security. Wanting more wasn't selfish. It was adaptive. Modern life simply gave that ancient instinct new targets. Instead of hunting for food, we hunt for promotions. Instead of collecting supplies, we collect achievements. Instead of worrying about survival, we worry about status. Modern society makes this incredibly easy. Every notification, every promotion, every purchase, every compliment, every new possession. Each one creates another small reward loop. Psychologists often describe this as the hedonic treadmill. The more you achieve, the faster your brain adjusts. Yesterday's dream quickly becomes today's normal. Then tomorrow, your brain starts looking for something even bigger. People aren't constantly chasing more because they're weak. They're chasing more because their brains are doing exactly what evolution designed them to do. But then there are the others. The people who seem to reach a certain point and simply stop needing more. Not because they couldn't keep climbing. Not because they failed. But because something inside them quietly changed. But then there are the others. The people who quietly stop wanting what everyone else still spends their lives chasing. They don't suddenly become monks. They don't reject money. They don't stop working. They simply stop measuring their lives by accumulation. They keep living. They just start playing by different rules. From the outside, it can look like they've lost their ambition. They turn down promotions. They buy smaller homes than they can afford. They stop replacing things that still work. They spend more time with friends than networking. To everyone around them, it almost looks like they've settled. Except they haven't. Here's what most people never realize. Their brains may actually be evaluating the exact same choices very differently. A fascinating area of research in behavioral psychology suggests that people who voluntarily simplify their lives often assign different emotional value to the same rewards. When most people see a higher salary, their reward system immediately focuses on what that money can buy. A bigger house, a nicer neighborhood, a newer car, more status. But people who need less to be happy often ask a completely different question. What will this cost me? Will it cost more free time? Will it create more stress? Will I sleep less? Will I have more responsibilities? Will I spend less time with the people I love? The reward doesn't automatically become bigger, because the trade-off becomes impossible to ignore. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a shift in value weighting. The reward hasn't disappeared. It's simply competing with something else. Autonomy, time, peace, freedom. Instead of asking, how much more can I have? Their brains slowly begin asking, what am I giving up to get it? Before anyone misunderstands this, it doesn't mean one way of living is better than the other. Some people genuinely enjoy ambitious careers. Some people find deep purpose in building businesses. Others find fulfillment in a quieter life. All of those choices are completely valid. But understanding why some people gradually stop wanting more is where things become truly fascinating. For almost everyone, there's a moment when the equation quietly changes. Sometimes it's burnout. You spend years working harder than ever, answering emails late at night, checking messages during dinner, thinking about work even while you're on vacation. Then one day, you realize your body has been trying to tell you something for years. The excitement is gone. Only exhaustion remains. For other people, it's a health scare. A doctor mentions high blood pressure, chronic stress, poor sleep, or tells you that your lifestyle simply isn't sustainable anymore. Suddenly, the things that once looked like success begin looking surprisingly expensive. Sometimes the change is much quieter. You watch your children grow up faster than you expected. You realize another year has disappeared. Or someone close to you passes away and leaves behind a sentence you can't stop thinking about. I wish I had spent more time living. Without even noticing it, your definition of success begins to change. And once that definition changes, your priorities slowly begin changing with it. But here's where things become even more interesting. Research in positive psychology suggests that people who consistently report high levels of life satisfaction while living with less often share one surprising psychological trait. They become better at distinguishing between pleasure and fulfillment. At first, those two words sound almost identical. But psychologically, they're describing two very different experiences. Pleasure is immediate. It's exciting. It's stimulating. And it asks very little of you. Fulfillment works differently. It develops slowly. It grows over time. Sometimes, you don't even notice it's happening until you look back. Most brains naturally prioritize pleasure. That's why buying something new feels exciting. It's why scrolling through social media is easier than reading a book. And it's why instant gratification almost always wins. Psychologists often refer to this as present bias. Your brain naturally gives greater importance to rewards you can experience right now than to rewards you'll only appreciate months or years later. That's why it's easier to order the dessert than prepare a healthy meal. It's easier to buy the expensive gadget than invest the money. It's easier to promise yourself you'll start saving next month. Your brain isn't trying to sabotage you. It's simply following a survival strategy that worked for thousands of years. But some people gradually begin experiencing something different. Whether through age, experience, hardship, or conscious reflection, their brains slowly become better at appreciating delayed rewards. Instead of asking, what will make me feel good today? They begin asking, what kind of life am I building? That single question changes everything. Owning fewer things no longer feels like a sacrifice. It feels like having less to maintain. Working fewer hours no longer looks like laziness. It starts feeling like freedom. Driving an older car no longer feels like failure. It becomes one less payment keeping you tied to a life you no longer enjoy. The reward hasn't disappeared. It has simply moved. It moves away from possessions and toward peace. Away from consumption and toward autonomy. away from status and toward time. That's not a lack of ambition. It's ambition pointing in a completely different direction. But that shift comes with a psychological challenge that very few people expect. The first challenge is identity. For years, and sometimes for decades, your possessions quietly become part of who you are. The neighborhood you live in, the clothes you wear, the car you drive, the job title you introduce yourself with. Without realizing it, those things slowly become part of your identity. They become your answer to the question, who am I? When you stop chasing those things, something uncomfortable happens. You have to answer that same question without using what you own. That isn't easy. Because if you're no longer trying to impress anyone, who exactly are you trying to become? But identity is only the beginning. The second challenge is something much older and much harder to ignore. Other people. Human beings have always looked around to decide whether they're doing well. Long before social media, performance reviews, or job titles existed, our ancestors survived by staying connected to the tribe. Belonging meant safety. Standing out meant risk. That instinct never disappeared. It simply found new ways to express itself. Today, instead of wondering whether the tribe accepts us, we wonder whether we're falling behind everyone else. When the people around you are buying bigger houses, getting promoted, posting photos of expensive vacations, and constantly upgrading their lifestyles, choosing less can feel surprisingly uncomfortable. People begin asking questions. Are you okay? Why don't you want more? Don't you have bigger goals? Most of the time, those questions come from genuine curiosity. But sometimes, your choices quietly challenge the story other people have been telling themselves. Because if happiness doesn't require everything they're chasing, then what exactly are they chasing? Psychologists have studied social comparison for decades. One conclusion appears again and again. People rarely evaluate success in isolation. They evaluate it relative to the people around them. That means choosing a different definition of success often creates invisible social pressure. Not because you're making a mistake, but because you stepped outside the path everyone expected you to follow. Then comes the third challenge. Fear. Not imagined fear. Real fear. If you choose a simpler life, you may earn less. You may accumulate less. You may decide that another promotion isn't worth the extra stress. Naturally, your mind begins asking difficult questions. What if I regret this someday? What if everyone else ends up ahead? What if my future self wishes I had worked harder? Those aren't irrational questions. They're deeply human ones. For many people, constant growth feels like security. The larger the savings account becomes, the safer the future seems. So when someone intentionally slows down, the brain can interpret that decision as moving away from certainty. Even when their financial situation remains stable, the emotional experience feels completely different. Because certainty and having enough are not always the same thing. Then there's one final challenge that almost nobody talks about. You don't just leave behind stress. You also leave behind the game itself. That may sound strange, but many people genuinely miss it. They miss the deadlines. They miss the competition. They miss the promotions. They even miss the feeling of constantly chasing the next milestone. Achievement creates structure. Every goal naturally leads to another goal. Every success points toward the next success. Life becomes measurable, clear, predictable. When you step away from that system, the scoreboard disappears. Without a scoreboard, you have to answer a much more uncomfortable question. How do you know you're living well when nobody else is keeping score? That's the moment when everything begins to change. Because that isn't just a financial decision. It's a psychological one. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Most people assume that once someone starts wanting less, happiness naturally follows. Less pressure. Less stress. More freedom. More time. a better life. Sometimes that's true. Research consistently shows that people who place a higher value on autonomy, meaningful relationships, and time often report greater life satisfaction than people who focus primarily on increasing their income. But that's only part of the story. Because something else happens when you stop chasing more. The direction that once organized your entire life quietly disappears. Think about it. When you're always pursuing the next promotion, the next purchase, or the next achievement, your path is already mapped out. You always know what comes next. Earn more. Buy more. Achieve more. Then repeat the process. It can be exhausting, but it's also incredibly simple. When you step away from that cycle, life becomes much less predictable. Suddenly, nobody is telling you what success is supposed to look like. That freedom sounds exciting, but psychologically, it can feel deeply uncomfortable. Because now you have to answer a question you've probably avoided for years. What actually gives my life meaning? Not what makes it look successful. Not what impresses other people. What genuinely makes it meaningful? Those are two completely different questions. Some people eventually realize they spent years collecting achievements without ever asking themselves why they wanted them in the first place. Others discover they stayed constantly busy because being busy prevented them from asking more difficult questions. Questions like, what kind of person do I want to become? What memories do I want to create? What kind of life would still feel meaningful if nobody else ever saw it? Those questions don't come with easy answers. In many ways, they're much harder than working another overtime shift or chasing another promotion. Achievement gives you instructions. Meaning asks you to create your own. That's why some people don't immediately become happier after simplifying their lives. The first thing they often experience isn't happiness. It's silence. Then uncertainty. Only later, after spending enough time with those uncomfortable questions, do they begin discovering something far more valuable than another achievement. They begin discovering themselves. Something else changes during this process. Without the constant stimulation of buying, competing, consuming, and achieving, the brain slowly begins adapting to a quieter rhythm. At first, everything feels slower. Sometimes it even feels boring. The excitement isn't as intense anymore. The dopamine spikes become smaller. For a while, it can feel like something important is missing. Psychologists describe this as a recalibration of the reward system. Instead of depending on constant novelty, your brain slowly relearns how to appreciate ordinary experiences. A peaceful morning. A long conversation with someone you care about. Cooking dinner without rushing. Reading a good book. Watching the sunset without reaching for your phone. The experiences themselves haven't changed. Your attention has. Things that once felt ordinary begin feeling surprisingly meaningful. And that may be one of the biggest psychological shifts a person can experience. Because when your attention changes, your entire definition of happiness quietly changes with it. So what does psychology actually teach us about people who need less to be happy? Not that they're smarter. Not that they've discovered a secret everyone else has missed. And certainly not that ambition is wrong. What changes isn't necessarily the world around them. It's the way they evaluate it. Most people spend years believing happiness exists somewhere in the future, after the next raise, the next purchase, the next achievement, the next version of themselves. Eventually, some people begin noticing a pattern. Every time they reach what once felt like enough, their definition of enough quietly moves again. The finish line keeps moving farther away, not because they're doing anything wrong, but because that's exactly how the human reward system works. The brain adapts remarkably quickly. Yesterday's luxury becomes today's normal. Yesterday's dream becomes tomorrow's expectation, and the cycle quietly continues. For some people, that realization changes everything. They stop asking, "How can I get more?" Instead, they begin asking, What already adds real value to my life? It seems like a small shift. Psychologically, it's enormous. Because attention is one of the most powerful forces shaping human happiness. Whatever your attention focuses on repeatedly, your brain gradually begins treating as important. If your attention is constantly drawn toward what you don't have, scarcity becomes your normal emotional experience. If your attention slowly shifts toward what you already have, gratitude becomes much easier to experience. That doesn't mean giving up on growth. It doesn't mean avoiding success. And it certainly doesn't mean pretending money doesn't matter. Money solves real problems. Security matters. Opportunity matters. Comfort matters. Psychology has never argued otherwise. What psychology repeatedly suggests is something much more balanced. Once your basic needs are met, your relationship with more often matters far more than the amount itself. Some people continue chasing because they genuinely enjoy the challenge. Others continue chasing because they no longer know how to stop. And a smaller group, almost without realizing it, begins choosing something different. They choose more time, more presence, more freedom, more meaningful relationships. Ironically, by wanting less, they often feel like they have more. Not because their lives suddenly became perfect, but because they stopped measuring them against everyone else's. Maybe that's why people who need less often appear so calm. It isn't because they escaped the pressures of modern life. They simply stopped allowing those pressures to define their happiness. Perhaps that's the most surprising psychological shift of all. Real happiness may not begin the moment you finally get everything you've ever wanted. It may begin the moment you realize you already have enough to start living differently. And maybe that's the question worth leaving you with. If the life you're chasing finally became yours tomorrow, would it truly make you happier? Or have you been searching for more, when what you've really been missing was a different way of looking at enough?